In a lab light that feels too cold for comfort, a geneticist stares at a sequence file that refuses to behave, while somewhere else a desert log sits cut clean through time. 3 reruns, 3 errors. At the same time, a desert caption says one log has rested unchanged for more than 200 million years, as if time itself missed a step. The woman across from him is 34, and her blood and bones point in directions medicine cannot comfortably explain. In Arizona, the answer is not blood, but mineral replacement. A grandmother warned her not to trace family names or heights. A desert visitor would ask the same thing in another language. Who cut these trees, and why does nobody claim it? In rural Poland, 2 hours from Krakow, a converted farmhouse holds genealogical shelves in 17 languages. In Arizona, a national park guards more than 300 fossil sites. Maria Kowolska, a former university archivist retired in 1998, has spent 30 years mapping families. The park was raised to national park status in 1962, but its stones kept their silence. Her study smells of old paper and wood smoke, and the winter air drops 5 degrees when you enter. Out west, the trance began in a wet, subtropical world near the equator. A wall map in the farmhouse glows with red pins over places official records say were empty. The desert has its own map, nearly 350 square miles of scattered logs. One family arrives with a 197-centimeter daughter, a 211-centimeter brother, and a father listed at 206. Another landscape offers a 6-foot log, sliced so neatly the sunlight catches it. An old photograph from 1937 shows a great-great-grandfather clearing a measured doorway by ½ a meter. In Arizona, the cross-sections also look measured, as if nature preferred precision over chaos. The doctors called the growth pattern impossible, normal childhood, then sudden acceleration after puberty. The desert answer is slower, but stranger cell by cell, structure preserved while substance vanished. An endocrinologist ruled out gigantism, and pituitary function looked normal. Meanwhile, those desert trunks keep their growth rings and vessels even after the wood is gone. Maria's folders hold 47 families, and one Slovak woman reached 3, 7 times normal density. Out in the park, more than 12 tons vanish each year into pockets and souvenirs. A Warsaw researcher tested 12 people from 6 families in 2003, then his paper vanished within 3 months. The park's first monument date came long before that, in 1906, under Theodore Roosevelt. He stayed alive, but stopped speaking about it. The question hangs over both stories. When records close, does the pattern disappear or simply move underground? The park lies in northeastern Arizona, across Navajo and Apache counties. The farmhouse stands in rural Poland, where roads turn to gravel and forests close in fast. One archive is physical shelves, the other is a geological field of fragments. Both are full of things that should have vanished, yet remain catalogued in detail. And here is the unsettling part. One family was told not to look back, while the other landscape invites endless looking. Both punish easy explanations. If the averages in one lineage never settle, and the trunks in one desert never decay, maybe the real clue is not origin but interruption. A basement freezer can preserve tissue. Volcanic ash can preserve wood. In both cases, burial is not the end, only the condition that makes evidence survive. The medical file says contamination. The park brochure says natural geology. Both are explanations that leave the most important question untouched. A retracted paper and stolen logs both suggest a hunger to possess what should stay where it is. That is a strange human constant, whether in files or in desert sand. For now, the farmhouse still keeps its shelves, and the park still keeps its trunks. One asks about family lines, the other asks about deep time. Maybe the real mystery is that both cases preserve the shape of what was lost, and maybe that shape is the only witness left standing. So the question remains open. If the past can harden into stone, and blood can carry a pattern nobody expected, what else have we mistaken for impossible? In the fluorescent hum of a Warsaw lab, a sequencing chart sits beside a lamplit folder of family notes. The two seem unrelated until both point to inheritance that behaves strangely. One line in the notes describes a protein sequence found in hemoglobin, shared across unrelated families. In another folder, a medical chart marks proportions that look enlarged rather than defective. That same paper trail also mentions 15 to 20% better cardiovascular performance, a detail that sounds like athletic advantage. Yet the real surprise is how the blood handles thin air, almost as if it expects it. At the same time, a second set of pages explains why stone can look carved when no tool touched it. Minerals can preserve structure so faithfully that the original material disappears. That process creates a visual paradox, a tree that no longer behaves like wood, yet still remembers its rings. The family files create a similar paradox, where bodies seem ordinary until measured. A research note from Warsaw says the pattern was tracked through 12 people in 6 families, then pulled back from publication. Nearby, the stone study gives a different kind of restraint nature preserves, but only after time rewrites the surface. The strange symmetry is this: one investigation loses access when the funding vanishes, while the other asks why a forest can survive without roots. Both leave behind fragments instead of full answers. In the stone case, the explanation turns on transport and burial. In the blood case, the explanation turns on inheritance and clustering. One preserves shape after impact, the other preserves function under stress. A village near Almaty appears in one file, and a fossil landscape appears in the other. In both, location matters less than what happened after people or trees were moved. And here comes the unsettling part. The blood story insists the pattern is too consistent to be random, while the stone story insists the fracture is too regular to be accidental. Yet neither claims a simple cause. That raises a sharper question than origin. If adaptation can persist in blood and mineral structure can persist in stone, what pressures were strong enough to leave both looking finished rather than broken? The lab pages mention a chromosome segment carrying several traits together, which makes the inheritance feel bundled rather than isolated. The fossil pages do something similar, because the surface tells one story while the hidden structure tells another. In the stone explanation, the surface can look machine cut because internal boundaries guide cracking. In the family files, repeated clustering across lineages suggests boundaries of a different kind, social, geographic, or both. A 1923 outbreak report from a village near Lviv adds a human edge to the blood files. Some lineages were affected far less severely than neighbors, as if the same illness met different terrain. Meanwhile, the stone narrative keeps circling back to what remains when life is gone, a record so complete that growth patterns survive after the organism does not. That is preservation without vitality. The blood notes suggest something comparable. The body adapts, then keeps that advantage across generations. But adaptation is not the same as explanation, and neither file is willing to settle for a neat label. One archive keeps tribes in separate locations. The other keeps strata in separate layers. Different storage systems, same instinct, protect what might otherwise be lost before anyone understands it. And that is the pattern worth sitting with. Both stories describe a hidden continuity beneath visible change. One appears in flesh, the other in stone, and neither behaves like an ordinary accident. So the sharper mystery is not whether the material changed. It did. The real question is why the change preserves structure so well in one case and functions so efficiently in the other. Maybe that is why the most compelling clues never arrive as proof. They arrive as parallels, a chart that should not match, a trunk that should not be so perfect, and silence where an answer ought to be. If a buried trunk can survive a stone for ages, perhaps a lineage can survive as pattern long after ordinary records fail. That possibility is only a theory, but it changes how both files feel, because in both worlds, absence is not emptiness. It is information waiting to be read from what remained intact when everything else vanished. The lab can measure the body, the field can measure the stone, but neither can yet explain why preservation so often arrives disguised as distortion. And maybe that is the real invitation here, not to force one answer, but to notice how often the surviving evidence refuses to stay in one category. Flesh and fossil keep crossing paths, so we end where the evidence begins, with a pattern that looks finished, yet keeps pointing beyond itself. Whether it belongs to blood, stone, or something still unnamed, the last word is not ours. In Maria's study, Katerina's letter sits beside a polished stone slab from Lesbos, and both seem to point toward inheritance no one could fully measure. What links a family warning to a volcanic forest? is the idea of continuity. In one case, traits travel through blood. In the other, shape survives in stone. In one lineage, illness moved differently through 4 generations. In another, the buried trunks kept their branches stripped away, yet their mass remained unmistakable. The 1923 village report near Lviv described a typhoid wave that hit hard overall, yet some family lines resisted in ways the authors could not explain. That same stubborn pattern appears in the stone story too. When burial happened locally, roots were preserved, but transported trunks left no matching trace upstream. Maria calls the family pattern a package because height, bone strength, blood chemistry, and immune behavior arrive together, as if one switch turns the whole line. Across 8 to 10 generations of charts, the same cluster keeps returning, and the silence around intermarriage begins to make a different kind of sense. Then comes the oddest part. Some people hear building hum, radio carriers, even the pressure in storms, while doctors find nothing unusual on standard tests. And that raises a harder question. If one archive is written in family lines, and the other in mineral layers, why do both seem to preserve memory without words? A Russian-language YouTube video from 2016 pushed the stone question into public frenzy, arguing that today's scrub is a reduced remnant of something far larger. Its boldest move was to read flat-top mesas as stumps, but the same appetite for pattern also appears in families trying to explain inherited difference. Devil's Tower became the center of that claim, yet its hexagonal columns point to cooling and contraction, not a hidden vascular system. A laboratory can reproduce the same geometry with drying starch, which makes the visual argument weaker, even as curiosity around the formation stays alive. But the deeper puzzle survives in the gaps, because the logs still arrived without matching root remnants, and that absence keeps dragging the story onward. In Maria's notes, the children's reports on geometry and engineering feel less like talent, and more like early recognition of pattern in the world. That makes the stone theory feel strangely adjacent. Both stories depend on people noticing structure before anyone can explain how it formed. Even the viral claim about silicon-based giants reveals a similar hunger. When ordinary explanations feel too small, the imagination reaches for another material. Yet the real tension is not between blood and rock, but between measurement and testimony, because both stories keep producing claims that instruments struggle to catch. That is why the strongest moments in both narratives are not conclusions, but mismatches, preserved roots without their source, perception without a device. And maybe that is the point. Some histories survive best when they are unfinished, forcing every generation to decide what counts as evidence. Maria's family charts and the stone forest both resist neat closure, and that resistance is what keeps them alive in conversation instead of certainty. So the puzzle widens rather than resolves. Inherited difference may travel in bodies, while ancient shape may travel in stone, and neither asks permission to remain. What matters now is not choosing the stronger story, but noticing how both keep circling the same silence. Something endured, and no tidy label survived it. That is where the discussion leaves us, with a lineage map on one side, a fossil forest on the other, and a shared refusal to disappear into a single explanation. And maybe the most honest ending is this: the pattern is real enough to notice, but incomplete enough to keep asking who or what first left it behind. In the candlelit study, Magdalena's grandson turns a stone fragment over while Maria studies the children's sketches. One suggests memory can travel through families. The other suggests it can survive inside rock. Maria's reports mention 12 children, and the strange overlap is not talent alone. Their notebooks show structures, angles, and room layouts that echo the same hidden language as the stone log's columns. One Polish boy drew acoustically precise chambers at 6. Nearby, the stone specimen's strange geometry invites the same question. Why do mines and minerals both seem to prefer order? Magdalena says her family was shifted 4 times, always into a new place. That rhythm matters, because scattered stories and scattered strata both resist easy mapping, even when the pattern feels deliberate. Then the stone log story cuts in. A late Triassic trunk sits beneath a younger layer, almost alone, as if time forgot to finish the page above it. That absence is called an unconformity, and it matters here because family histories also show abrupt breaks. In both cases, what remains is real, but the middle has been stripped away. At Yellowstone, 27 stacked fossil layers once told a slow story. Later work pointed toward volcanic mud flows instead, and that speed echoes the way family legends can collapse decades into one warning. William Fritz's 1980 paper on the mountain age, Helen's eruption, gave that mechanism a live demonstration. But the odd part is how often the easiest story survives longer than the better one. On the family side, the same resistance appears in school notes, where children build forms they were never taught. On the geology side, trunks are repositioned by force. Influence travels differently, yet both leave surprise behind. And here comes the harder question. If children can map structure without instruction, and trees can be buried upright without original roots, what exactly is being preserved? Maria stops at the word exposure. Magdalena prefers the word hearing. Neither is proof, but together they hint that memory may arrive through sensing before it ever becomes language. That is where the stories quietly meet. One speaks of body-held inheritance, the other of stone that keeps a vanished shape. Both resist the idea that matter is merely passive, yet the method stays different. One side relies on oral transmission across generations, the other on mineral replacement after burial, a process that can preserve rings, vessels, and even delicate shape. A child in Kazakhstan reproduces a huge structure from speech alone, while the stone record preserves a form no one planted there by hand. Both ask whether resemblance can outlive explanation, and just when the pattern feels almost comforting, it isn't. The question becomes whether preservation is protection or simply a different way of hiding what was once obvious. Magdalena's grandfather claimed their people once built the world's great structures, guided by how stone wanted to sit. The claim is impossible to verify, but the phrasing itself is strangely technical. Meanwhile, geologists accept the missing span without drama, because erosion can be brutal. Still, that calm explanation does not explain why the human story sounds so protective. The same tension repeats in Yellowstone. A simple forest-by-forest tale fits neatly, yet the mudflow evidence made that neatness collapse. Some stories survive because they are easier to repeat than to test. That becomes the bridge between the two threads. In one, a family is told not to gather. In the other, layers are read as separate forest until a faster mechanism appears. So perhaps the deeper clue is not giants or petrification, but retention. What survives pressure? What gets moved? What can still be recognized after everything else has shifted? Maria has no final answer, and that restraint matters. The records point towards selective memory in people and selective survival in stone, but neither file closes cleanly, and that may be the point. Not a verdict, but a threshold, where testimony becomes pattern, and pattern becomes a question that refuses to stay in one discipline. The stone log still lies there, and the family still tells its warnings. Neither asks permission from the other, yet both continue to insist that the past can remain physically present. Maybe that is why the ending stays unfinished. Once you notice how often memory hides inside material form, you start seeing archives in bones and forests in silence. And the last question is still open. If some things are preserved by stone and others by blood, what else around us is waiting to be read before it disappears again? At the table, Maria slides a brittle 1823 register beside a stone log photograph, and both seem to ask the same question: who gets preserved and who gets buried? One page mentions tall stone builders and a forced relocation in 1847. The other speaks of trunks so cleanly split that even ancient hunters used them as tools. That contrast matters, because the register implies a people scattered by order, while the logs suggest a landscape that kept its testimony in plain sight. In the desert, the logs are not roots, bark, or branches at all. Under magnification, they hold carbon-based cells that were replaced by minerals. Maria keeps calling them markers. The desert keeps calling back, with fractures so precise they make every easy explanation feel too small. And yet the stone side has its own archive. Hunters, thousands of years ago, recognized the material, and a later community built with it like masonry. So both cases hinge on recognition. One group was told to stop tracing ancestry, while another generation simply walked past immense evidence and used it without asking why. The tension deepens when Maria says the data keeps accumulating because the stone question also survives by accumulating small ignored observations over time. But the geology side has a warning too. Some clean stories survive only because people mistake certainty for patience and never look hard enough. That is why the unanswered questions matter. If stone can outlast memory, and blood can carry patterns, what other evidence has been mistaken for background noise? The idea of height returns here, not as spectacle, but as a clue. A body can become evidence, just as a trunk can become a record. Seen that way, the register's silence and the log's fracture faces become twin forms of testimony, one written in ink and one in mineral grain. And then comes the harder part. If someone ordered a village dismantled, who decided which traces deserve to survive elsewhere? The same puzzle appears in the fossil landscape. Trunks remain, but the roots people expect are often absent, leaving the map feeling strangely unfinished. That absence is not proof of a dramatic story by itself, but it is enough to keep the question alive when easy answers arrive too quickly. In Maria's room, that caution becomes practical. In the field, it becomes geological, because both stories punish people who declare certainty too early. So the strongest thread is not a finished answer, but a pattern, scattered evidence, partial explanations, and survivors asking what was hidden in plain sight. The register never names every family, and the logs never explain every missing chapter, but both refuse to disappear under one tidy explanation. Maybe that is why the final question feels bigger than either story alone. Whether a lineage or a landscape, preservation can still be a form of concealment. And if that sounds unsettling, it should. The things we call records may survive only because they were never fully understood. The desert teaches restraint, the table teaches restraint, and both suggest the same discipline. Read carefully before you explain the world away. Because once a clue is treated as background, the next generation inherits silence, and that is how both villages and forests vanish without a dramatic ending. So the last move is not certainty but attention. Keep the register open, keep the stone visible, and let both answer what they can. What survives may not be the loudest story, only the one that still rewards patient reading after everyone else has moved on. And maybe that is the real mystery left on the table tonight. Not whether the past exists, but how many forms it can wear before we finally notice.